And even as an aviator, I've never believed that air power alone can achieve the kind of political goals associated with regime change. To really achieve the negation of their nuclear capability and their ballistic military capability, there's only one way you're going to do that 100%, and that's with a land invasion, and that's not going to happen.
Of course, on one side, you've got Israel and the United States deploying weapons at will, and they've used extreme amount of air power, including F-22s, F-35s. We've got P-1 Lancers. We've seen B-52s. So we've seen the entire armada that the United States has. On the other hand, we've got Iran, almost no air force.
Donald Trump's attitude to NATO makes me despair sometimes. He talks of NATO as though the United States is on the outside of NATO. But he also talks as though somehow the United States funds NATO.
Welcome to FO Talks. With me is Peter Hoskins, a retired British officer who served in the Royal Air Force, who now lives in France. Peter commanded a squadron in air-to-air refueling in the First Gulf War. He also worked with NATO extensively, and he commanded a station before retiring. Peter, very quickly, can you tell our viewers where all you've served, what all you've done, and why you're the right person to talk to when it comes to the war in the Gulf right now?
I'm sure that I'm just one of many who would be appropriate to talk to. And my experience is somewhat dated, but of course I do follow events closely. My career, in a nutshell, was I spent a number of tours as a pilot initially on the nuclear strike role, flying Vulcan bombers. Subsequently, I had a period at the NATO Defence College, then at Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe as a policy officer, command of a squadron, and as you mentioned, during the First Gulf War, back to NATO, this time to NATO headquarters, working as the military assistant or chef de cabinet for the director of the international military staff, at a busy time with the wars in the former Yugoslavia, and also after the fall of the wall and the attempts for the Partnership for Peace with former Warsaw countries. After that, I returned to the UK for a further tour as a station commander of a base, and then left the Royal Air Force and moved on to other things. But that included a period working for the project for the use of Airbus aircraft as tanker transports for the RAF.
Right, Peter. So you've done it all. You've flown missions that involve bombing. You've commanded a squadron that looks at the air logistics, which is very important, air-to-air refueling, something that Israel has heavily relied onto the U.S. Air Force in this campaign. So very quickly, what do you make of Israel and America's aerial campaign in Iran?
If we look at it in entirely a military perspective of how the operation was conducted, then it's probably pretty much picture perfect in terms of because of the coordination of large numbers of aircraft in combat and support zones. And certainly when I think back to the First Gulf War, when it was multinational, and perhaps it was the early days of this level of coordination, but everything then was carried out in radio silence, and I imagine it's much the same. And so it's an impressive performance. But then, on the other hand, when you look at what's been achieved, then perhaps it's not quite all that it's cracked up to be, or it's set out to be. We've heard from Donald Trump on numerous occasions that everything has been destroyed, and yet that seems to be followed almost immediately by another salvo of ballistic missiles. And similarly, Israel has claimed very high levels of destruction of launchers and missiles. And yet I heard a quote last night, how accurate it is I don't know, that in fact there are many thousands of drones and missiles which remain in the inventory of Iran.
Yes, and what's interesting has been is how Israel and the US have coordinated this entire campaign. Yes, it's tactically it's brilliant. They've flown more than 10,000 sorties, and not just fighter aircraft. It's involved AVACs, it's involved air-to-air refuelers, it's involved a lot of complex machinery in in a designated airspace, going at it day in and day in and night. But that has not really, as you rightfully pointed out, achieved political goals. So it looks like achieving air superiority has not really translated into political goals that Trump and Netanyahu set out.
I think one of the problems as an observer from the outside is trying to understand what those political goals really have been. If the lack of clarity that we see is also apparent in the planning circles, then it must be extremely difficult for the commanders to know what on earth they're supposed to be doing. If the thought was that, and it seems to be the case that Netanyahu believed it, or at least he persuaded Donald Trump that it was the case, that they could overthrow the regime with air power, then I think that was, well, who knows what's going to come in the weeks and months ahead, but at the moment there seems to be no sign that the regime has collapsed. And I can't help thinking that if we go back to the early theoreticians of air power in the 1930s, Mitchell and Dewey, there was always a claim that somehow the bomber was unstoppable and that air power would reduce public morale to nothing, and therefore the war could be won with air power. And even as an aviator, I've never believed that air power alone can achieve the kind of political goals associated with regime change. Perhaps, yes, you can destroy manufacturing capability. Yes, you can destroy launchers, and yes, you can destroy weapons stocks. How far you can go in destroying the nuclear capability is another question. Bearing in mind that we were told by Donald Trump that it had been achieved back last year. But there's no doubt that you can put it back for a long way. But achieving regime change, I doubt it very much. So I understand, of course, Donald Trump, the last thing he wants to do is put troops on the ground in Iran. But if the objective really was regime change and to really achieve the negation of their nuclear capability and their ballistic military capability, there's only one way you're going to do that 100%, and that's with a land invasion, and that's not going to happen.
Right. And okay, so I want to now move on to the asymmetry that we've seen in this war. And on of course, on one side, you've got Israel and the United States deploying weapons at will, and they've used extreme amount of air power, including F-22s, F-35s. We've got B-1 Lancers. We've seen B-52s. So we've seen the entire armada that the United States has. On the other hand, we've got Iran, almost no air force. In fact, for an aviation enthusiast myself, it was a tragic sight seeing those F-4 Phantoms and F-14 Tomcats being of the Iranian Air Force getting taken out without having the ability to even put up a fight. However, Iran did fire a salvo of missiles. In fact, the number has already reached almost 8,000 missiles, both short and medium range, and we don't even know the amount of drones that they fired. And just using these missiles and drones, they've severely hit airports across the Gulf. They've hit water desalination plants. They've hit data centers. They've hit oil refineries in Saudi Arabia, in the UAE, in Qatar, in Kuwait. So effectively, Iran has been able to control airspace over the UAE's airport, for example, or the airport in Riyadh without even having an air force. It's just using missiles and drones. So how do you assess Iran's war fighting strategy?
Well, first of all, I think that the use of missiles and drones is just another aspect of air power, from my perspective. I think the Iranians have recognized for many years that they were never going to be able to build up conventional manned air force capability, which was going to be a match to their potential enemies in the region, i.e. Israel and the United States, or indeed Saudi Arabia or the Gulf states. And so they had to think of another strategy, and that they were smart enough to conclude that the best way to do that was through unmanned vehicles, through drones and through their ballistic missiles. And of course, they've had the chance to experiment and learn from their drone capacity through the use of their drones in the Ukraine war as well. So yes, it is asymmetric, but it's clever asymmetry, and I can't say I'm surprised that they still continue to fight. Donald Trump seemed to have the opinion that the war would perhaps be over within a couple of weeks. Well, one of the problems, of course, is that it takes one country to start a war, but it takes two to finish it, and unless everybody agrees that the time is over, it will go on. So yeah, I mean, I think it's a well thought out and a clever strategy.
Right. And one of the, I should say, fallouts of this war has been Trump's messaging, of course, yes, towards Iran, but definitely towards NATO. He's threatened NATO with everything. He says he's going to exit NATO. He says NATO is dead. He says NATO is irrelevant. You've been in NATO. How do you see a sitting US president's threats towards NATO? And do you think the security alliance is at its weakest it's ever been?
Donald Trump's attitude to NATO makes me despair sometimes. He talks of NATO as though the United States is on the outside of NATO, but he also talks as though somehow the United States funds NATO. Now, clearly, the United States spends a fortune on its own armed forces, but the common budget of NATO, to which everybody contributes, is relatively small. It's a single figures billions for the headquarters and common infrastructure, it's etc. But he speaks as the. I don't know whether this is rhetoric for home consumption or whether he really thinks it. But surely he must understand that the purpose of NATO and the scope of NATO is well defined within its treaty for defence within the North Atlantic area, and that the only time that a member of NATO has evoked Article 5 is the United States after the Twin Towers attack. And he dismisses the sacrifices that were made by many countries within Europe to contribute to the war in Afghanistan after the Twin Towers. So I find that very frustrating. I find it very frustrating as well because I've worked alongside and for American officers in my appointments in NATO and indeed in the Gulf War. And I've had a lot of time and a lot of respect for them, and I wonder somehow how some of them feel about this attitude from Donald Trump at the moment. In terms of him leaving NATO, as I understand it, he would require 2/3 majority in the Senate to leave NATO or a special act of Congress. And I suspect that would be a pretty high hurdle for him to cross. But I also wonder whether he really thinks through what NATO means for the United States. Even if there's not direct support for the United States, there's been secondary support. Both the UK and France have had assets out in the Gulf, downing drones and missiles in the Gulf and in Jordan. He was able to put his carrier into Suda Bay in Crete and subsequently in Croatia. If the United States were not in NATO, would he have access to those ports or so easily? And I think that the United States needs to reflect on what the NATO brings for them. There's the bigger geostrategic picture, of course, of whether he wants to see Europe being the risk under the heel of Russia, however improbable that may seem. Perhaps he doesn't care. But in terms of his self-interest, he really ought to recognize that there's value for the United States in having its network of worldwide bases.
Well, Peter, perhaps Trump can't do it, but let's say 2 years down the line in 2028, we get either Marco Rubio as president or JD Vance as president. Perhaps the Democrats can't make it to the White House. And somehow they have a majority in Senate and they pull out of NATO. Do you think Europe itself can sustain the security alliance without the United States?
Yes, I think so. There are certainly deficiencies in defence for which we rely too heavily on the United States for real-time intelligence, target acquisition, suppression of enemy air defenses, and electronic warfare being just some of them. But there's no lack of technical capacity in Europe to replace those systems if the will is there. Now, of course, most of NATO forces are contributed by individual nations, but there is precedent for there to be common assets. For example, within the NATO Airborne Early Warning Squadron, the E3 Squadron. So there's no reason why there couldn't be the development of some of these capabilities over time. Now, of course, time is of the essence, and I imagine that even if the United States were to decide to withdraw, this is not going to happen overnight. Also, if I were being cynical, I might say, well, the longer that the war in Ukraine goes on, the more time that gives the rest of Europe to prepare, because the Russians are going to be so tied down there, they're not likely to try another adventure elsewhere. So yes, I go back to your question about whether NATO is weak because of this. I don't think I'm not sure that NATO is weak because of it. I mean, NATO has had its crises before. Its crises with at the time of Suez, when the Americans failed to support the British and French attempt to retake the Suez Canal. The withdrawal of French forces from the integrated military structure under de Gaulle, the occasional crises in the past between Greece and Turkey. We've managed to ride through those storms, and I'm sure that we'll be able to ride through this. I sometimes feel that it's a little bit like the girlfriend or the wife or the husband or the boyfriend, whichever way you want to look at it, who continually threatens to leave. You come to a point where you say, for God's sake, go. I don't think we'll get to that, but it's very frustrating.
Okay, let me throw a curveball at you, because given the scenario right now, it looks like Europe is the most divided it's been. And correct me if I'm wrong, since the Cold War, because on one hand, towards Eastern Europe, you've got Russia and Ukraine. They're fighting. European nations that are part of NATO and are bordering Russia, especially like Poland, are very nervous that the fighting could escalate, and the area of conflict could increase, including, and Poland could come under fire. Now you've got this war in Iran, which right now, as we speak, there is a short ceasefire. However, it's really divided the European nations. Spain, their Prime Minister Sanchez, he's outrightly refused to take part in this. Italy and several other European nations have refused the United States from using their airspace. And you've got British Prime Minister Keir Starmer also saying that he will not be open to attacking Iran. So, given what's happening both in Russia and Ukraine, given what's happening in Iran, where is Europe in all of this? It looks like one side of Europe is focused only on Russia, the other side is focused on not getting involved in Iran, and they've got a big energy crisis. They've got Trump threatening to leave NATO. It looks like Europe is really on the back foot here.
I'm not so sure that I agree with all of that. I think there are differences in emphasis. I think the problem for the European nations is that they still cling to the post-war settlement of the rule of law and the rule of international law. But on the other hand, they're not going to be sorry to see the end of the nuclear capability of Iran, and they're not going to be sorry to see the end of the regime if that's what achieved. And so that's put them in a bit of a bind. But I think, okay, the Spanish position perhaps stands out as being the outlier, but in general, I think we're talking about degrees of emphasis. Because everybody across the border says, no, this isn't our war. Part of that, I think, comes back to the fact that, of course, the United States didn't consult its allies, and then we've gone through the hoop of we don't need you till we need you, or you're useless. Um, and of course, when you've got a war where the objectives are so unclear, to join it at a later stage is risky to say the least. I can't remember who it was. I saw a quote the other day of somebody, a French general, who said, "Joining the war at this stage is like buying tickets for the Titanic after it's hit the iceberg." And I think there's perhaps, which I. There are divisions. There are certainly differences of opinion, and we see that with Hungary in particular, with its attitude towards the war in Ukraine. Uh, but on the other side, of course, 5 years ago, who would have thought that Finland and Sweden would have been NATO members?
Hmm.
Um, I think there's more that unites us than divides us. And I think if you come to the point where you've got a great threat, a real threat which arises within Europe, then I think there will be this coming together. Of course, your perspective of Russia varies a little bit depending on the distance from the from the likely fighting. So clearly that concentrates the mind much more in the Baltic states and in Poland than it does in France or the United Kingdom.
Right. Peter, lastly, before we wrap this up, there's been some interesting messaging that's come out of Europe that I want you to talk about and tell our global audience why this is happening now and what does it mean going further. And I'll start with the UK, Britain. Um, Prime Minister Keir Starmer has been very engaged. He's been very vocal, and he is. It looks like he's referring to UK tilting and staying with the EU, or at least European allies. And then you've got President Macron in France, who's saying France will give a nuclear umbrella to Europe. And then you've got Germany, who are now preventing fighting age men from leaving the country. It looks like Europe's preparing for war. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Um, as I understand it, it's not so much that the Germans are preventing fighting age men leaving, but they will be required to, if they're going to leave for more than 3 months, they will be required to go through a procedure to notify and ask permission, but it's unlikely to be refused, etc., etc. In terms of the UK getting closer to Europe, there's two strands of that. There's a strand of getting closer to the European Union back in terms of economics. In terms of defence, I think the UK has already been working very closely with obviously within NATO, but also outside of NATO with the French and various other nations. Macron and the extension of the nuclear umbrella. I don't think there's. I think there's rhetoric here, but there's no real change in substance. But in the end, the French will use that and would use the nuclear weapon if it was a direct existential threat to them. Now, it may well be that one could imagine situations where something's happening elsewhere in Europe, to Germany, for example, where they'd prefer to use the nuclear weapon while the threat was still in Germany rather than when the threat was in France. But I don't think that's a fundamental change, frankly. So one thing I think is quite positive, because of the fact that I've never been a fan of the idea of some kind of European EU-based defence system which would replicate NATO's, is that in fact there's not much talk now of European. There is talk about the EU funding more expenditure on weapons systems, which is a good thing, and I agree with that. But I think there seems to be at least a tacit understanding that any kind of framework for European defence is better built around NATO. If, for example, the United States withdrew from NATO, then I think I'm correct in saying that within every command where there is a an American officer as the commander. Deputy or his chief of staff is from another nation. So it's not as though you're suddenly the command structure by the Americans withdrawing.
Brilliant. Peter, thank you very much for speaking to Fair Observer and for sharing these wonderful insights and giving us a perspective of someone who's flown in the area and why and what's happening with this war in Iran.
Okay, thank you very much, Rohan.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.